Welcome to the Brazil Forum UK 2020. I am Marina Sperafico. I study Master in Gender Development and Globalization at the London School of Economics, and I will host you today in this session, Women and Pandemic. These and all the other sessions are being realized thanks to the voluntary work of our organizing committee and also the support of our sponsors, Fundação Haddad, Fundação Lehman, Idea Big Data, and the law offices PGMBM and Matos Filhos. And also our broadcaster who is a sponsor as well, Estadão. They are giving us the opportunity to broadcast this event for the whole world, live and freely. The issues of gender are complex and transversal in all the socio-economic components. And in Brazil, this is linked and are to the wound caused by the structural racism, the discrimination, the violence, and the extreme social inequality. The pandemic increased the violence in gender, impacted on the income of the women that were already vulnerable, and increased the workload in the household for the women who traditionally did that work. In this context, it is needed to understand how to build up innovative public policies in Brazil that are linked to the urban fringe initiatives that articulate gender, race, and class. And for that, I would like to invite our guests for today, the panelists, Débora Diniz, who is a professor of law at the University of Brasília and Brown University, Malu Gatto, who studies gender, political behavior, representation, and formulation of policies in Brazil, Marina Reidel, who is a master in education, founder of the Network for Trans Teachers in Brazil, and the director of the Department for Promotion of LGBT Rights in Brazil. Monique Evelle, who is the voice of the Black feminists in Brazil, and an entrepreneur. I would like to start this discussion giving a context to my question. I would like to give you some data. Women are really 80% on the front line of the combat of COVID. We are nearly 7 million women who lost our jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. Domestic violence became worse and the oppression of the LGBT population also. We have important discussions to be had in this area and also about the informal work, which is mainly carried out by women. And an example of that is the death of Menino Miguel. So with this context, I would like to start asking Débora, why does it happen? Why is so difficult, so challenging to have a provocative dialogue about gender in Brazil? Marina, I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody else that organized this event and put us together to talk about that. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a great opportunity to be here. What you mentioned is a map with numbers, specific stories, and we have a crossing of the pandemic with all these other issues. Yesterday, I saw a article in New York Times. There was an article that asked, will women be mothers or will they be workers? Will they look after the children at home or will they look after others? And in the pandemic, I believe that the pandemic will generate an expansion of the role. And your question is, why is so hard to talk about gender in Brazil? In Brazil, it was difficult to talk about gender even before the pandemic. And this intersectionality, when we talk about all the issues of sexuality and social class, this is central and is an axis for debate in terms of the lives that we want to live in society. And I can give you two answers to that. One of them comes from a long tradition of Brazilian life, and another one is the political archetype that we live in Brazil at the moment. We come in Brazil from a patriarchal heritage. And I'm not talking just about a hegemony of males and the masculine power against women. And you talked about the example of Miguel, the boy who died in Brazil 1 month ago. Well, in that case, what we have is an hierarchy among women. So this is a woman that had to bring her household helper in the middle of pandemic to do her household work because she believed that that it was essential. And this is a patriarchal sort of behavior. In actually, this comes from a masculine domination. And this is a domination of all the bodies that are not classified as masculine. And this is before us, when we talk about the increase of the violence against women, the killing of women, femicide. This is not because of the pandemic. And this is not because of the confinement. It is because of the patriarchal framework comes before that. And one way of controlling women is with violence. And when we hear these tragic narratives, and when I look at the politics that we live, when we look at the politics of space, of meeting our differences, we can have uh, political configurations that are different, but they should talk to each other. But a few weeks ago, we had the first woman died. Uh, one of the women who died in Brazil because of a clandestine abortion. She died using an abortion method that it was used in the 80s because she used a probe. This is something that it was used in the 80s. And she died without a name. Her death does not have a name because in her death certificate is not going to be said that she died because of an abortion. They're going to say something else. So this is the patriarchal framework that kills this woman. So we have two levels that are meeting each other. One that comes from a long-standing journey, and another one that is a short story, if I can say that. Malu, what is your opinion about that? Why it's so hard to maintain this provocative dialogue in Brazil about gender? Thank you, Marina. Before I answer your question, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to share this space with the others, to be here with Marina Reidel, Débora Diniz, Monique Evelle, and I am very happy to be here. And I am happy to have this opportunity to talk about this topic that is so urgent at this moment. I believe that is important to talk about this topic and talk about the emergency and the urgency of the topic. As it was said by Débora, gender equality came prior to the pandemic. But the pandemic created new ways of violence, new inequalities among gender. So it is important to talk about this whilst the problem is happening, and in a moment that we can collect data short, medium, and long term, so we can create opportunities to deal with this situation from a gender perspective. I won't talk very much about the topics that Débora approached. I think that she explained really clearly the points. I will talk about something else. One of the difficulties of dealing with gender is the lack of interest from the population, because reducing inequalities means reducing powers of some groups, of some people. And there are some groups and people that they are not willing to change their situation because of the reality of others. So there is the issue of political will, political interest, and we know that the representation that we have at the National Congress and the National Congress and the executive at the moment, they do not have an interest in representing these causes. I would like also to talk about the difficult, the difficulty, the real difficulty of really reducing gender inequality. Deborah mentioned the political issue, the structural issue, but one of the things that people that work with public policies have noticed and have emphasized in the last few years is the need of creating, designing public policies that already think ahead of how these policies can apply to all people in a homogeneous way. And gender is something that gender has been built up in a certain way, has been constructed in a way that the public policy doesn't take that into account. And when we create nowadays public policies that do not take into account gender and these inequalities, reducing inequalities, they are also public policies that sometimes actually increase the, the inequalities in gender. For example, here in the London School of Economics, we have a master that is just about inequalities from a gender perspective. And when we look into this, the theory says when we think about equality of gender, we have to think about all the policies on a transversal manner. We have to think about these policies in all levels, federal, state, municipality. So we need to create good public policies. And this, in addition to what it was has been said by Deborah, uh, needs political will, political commitment to reduce these inequalities. So these two things together are part of this complex problem. This lack of interest in dealing with that makes it difficult to reduce these inequalities. I will stop here, and later on, I hope that later on I can talk a little bit more about these
Com certeza, Malu. Na
complexities.
verdade, acho que é uma das
Yes,
questões
Malu.
centrais da nossa conversa de
This
hoje,
is one of
essa
the
coisa
central
das
points of our
transversalidades
conversation
da questão de gênero.
today
Não
is
é algo
how
que
we can
tem
think in
que
terms of
ficar
transversality in
em
gender.
todos. A gente tem que
I
discutir em todos os
think that
lugares, em
this
todas as
should be
construções.
debated all the
E eu
time,
queria
not just in this
aproveitar uma
panel.
fala que você fez, né, uma
I
parte
would
da sua
like
fala,
to
sobre a
mention
questão do poder.
something that you
E
commented.
isso eu acho
You
que é
were talking
algo
about the issues of
fundamental de
power.
compreender.
This is
E eu acho que a
fundamental.
Monique faz isso muito bem. E a forma como
Monique is a person that deals with that quite
muito
well, and she
estratégica
talks
e
about it.
efetiva
She uses this in a strategic and effective manner,
sempre traçando caminhos que trazem de fato
always
transformação
creating new
e
paths
mudança
that
para
bring
acontecer. E aí eu
transformation.
queria que você falasse um pouco
And
para a
I
gente,
would
Monique,
like to
por
ask you,
favor,
Monique,
como que você
could you
enxerga
please tell
a
us
questão do avanço da questão de gênero
how
no
do you
Brasil
see
e as principais
the
barreiras para que isso
advancement
aconteça?
of gender in Brazil and what are the barriers for us to have more equality of gender? This is a very good question, but it's a complex question. I don't have the answers because I am in this journey myself with the people that are here. I will try to answer both questions. It is very hard to talk about gender equality. And it is very hard actually to have gender equality as a priority because gender equality and racism, as it was said by the previous panelists, these are problems, they are treated as universal, but it's not. This is to do with the rationalization of this attitude. This comes from the idea that the other is different And this, of course, was constructed in different moments. Besides that, we have the thing that is called name and surname. It is silly, the same way that whiteness has name and surname is exactly like male. So you can imagine that the black people do not have name or surname. And if you look at the history of humanity and in Brazil, this is extremely serious. And there is another point that I would like to add to that is movement. The same way that Black people have a difficulty in moving from a space to another, so they have a barriers to their mobility. In this moment of pandemic, we are seeing, for example, the Black men, they have difficulties of using the mask. Actually, they do not use the masks because they are scared of being considered uh, a criminal or a suspected criminal. I use my hair. My hairstyle is enough for people to look at me as a black person and think that I am suspicious. And then there is the issue of gender. Who are the women? And I think that Deborah talked about that. What are the women that can circulate, that can be mobile? Where can they go? And I think that there are certain difficulties when we talk about that. This sense of universality, this movement, and this problem with name and surname, it's all related with racial issues, social economic issues. I think that is quite, I thought that it was funny when you said that I do this well. I have a statement that say, it's not that I like doing what I do. I don't have any other option. For me, this is survival. I like Zeca Pagodinho. This is like, but what I do is survival. And how do I do that? There is another mantra that I use that apply to the way that we work at the Desabafo project that I work. How can we establish a line that is good for all, a common line that is good for all? This is extremely hard in Brazil, a country that is very polarized. We are not binary any longer. We have gone beyond. We have a denial of the existence of people, and everything that we do is not enough when we look into these issues under the context of a global pandemic. So we have to think about a meeting point, and we have to create new paths for everybody. And of course, within my own reality bubble, this is related to education. So it is a cliche. Everybody talks about education for all, but we have to understand who is this all that people are talking about. If we think about all the decrees that we have in Brazil, all the laws applied about who can have access to education, another pillar for integration is communication. We know that we need to adapt the language for the different contexts and to give access to different groups and make sure that our communication can reach the groups that we want to talk to. This should be a conversation that applies in the bars and pubs, not just at the university. We have to create public policies that can conquer minds and hearts. And of course, there is another point that is important: money on the pocket. Money in the pocket of the women is what will help them achieve equality. I would like to finish this round of questions talking to Marina. Marina, I know that you are in your context. I would like to ask you, why do you think that it's so difficult to talk about gender? And it would be interesting to understand the roots of the problem. Perhaps you mentioned that was, uh, perhaps if we know that, we can create dialogues and create new paths, new ways. I would like to greet all the guests present here. I would like to thank you for this invitation. And I would like to say that it's important to be near such brilliant women are as these ones that are here. And I think that it's important to be here and congratulate all of you to invite such a diverse group. It is a challenge to think about gender. I am a transgender, transsexual woman. And if you think that in terms of public policy and think about this transsexual group, this is another challenge altogether. This is a challenge that came well before the pandemic, as it was mentioned before. Why that? Our society is a society that has a culture of that is a society that is quite LGBT phobic, that is transphobic. And this is our reality. And I believe that this will continue for a long time. Even though we are trying to advance to progress, we have to take that into account. We have the problem of education. Education alone won't solve this. So if you look all this context in Brazil, we have to think as well that the violence happens in all the different spaces. So we have to think about a public policy, an affirmative public policy uh, within a society that doesn't recognize our bodies. Our bodies are not recognized by the government, by the institutions, by the society. So we have challenges there, and they are very clear. And we today we have a transsexual within this space, this institutional space. So this should give us enough uh, to think in terms of the daily challenges. Why the transvestite can enter in some places. In the 70s, she couldn't even go out in the street because she would be considered a prostitute. So she was already earmarked. She was a marker of prostitution. But nowadays, we still have spaces where this transvestite or transsexual do not have access at all. And the public policy have to create access to these people. We have to think about this population that are there. We have to think about that state, that municipalities that have their own rules, that have their own politics. We have to think about what are the bodies that can have access in some places but not in others. Our bodies as transactions can be in everywhere, in every place. How can we rethink public policy to improve the lives of people? But what people are we talking about? What are the people that we really want to reach? And this is a challenge. And this is a daily challenge added to other factors. Violence is still part of our daily life. Brazil is, is considered the champion of killing LGBT people, in particular transsexual people. So this is shown by some of the studies already published. So how can we think about this daily violence that is attacking us just because of what we are, just because we live in our bodies as we understand our own body. We have our own desires and our relationship with whoever we want. So I believe that I think that this is an opportunity to think about this and bring all these issues to the surface. Marina, you talked about bodies, about transsexuals. Monique talked about mobility, movement, and this is related to some presumptions and universal thoughts that we create here. And some of the issues of gender are related to some say that actually uh, some say that actually this construction the social construction and these presumptions that we have about men and women. Sometimes we believe that women, we see women as this universal being without considering all the transversalalities existing. So in and and I don't think that we can have a conversation about women without considering transversality. So I would like to ask you, what is the impact of this universal thought, or universalization of the woman? How do you see this? How can we look at this within this context of pandemic?
Essa é uma pergunta que eu acho que nós conseguimos avançar na nossa
I
conversa.
think that actually we
Não
have
sei se a gente
managed to
sabe
advance in our
parte de um
conversation.
falso
This essentialization
de que
comes from a false
de que
presumption
a
that is
naturalização e a
nature, that there is
normalização
everything is that
que
there are
que
naturalization
trouxe a
normal.
Monique de
And I would like
ser
to
uma mulher
follow
conversando com
up on the
pessoas, com
provocation that
acadêmicas
Monique put across.
conhecedoras do
We are
tema,
talking with the world now. We are
pensando
not
de
talking
que
just with
nós não
academics.
queremos um novo normal no campo dos
We don't want to
direitos.
have just a
Nós
new
queremos
normal in
desafiar a
gender.
própria ideia da
We want to
normalidade. E a
challenge the
pandemia
idea
nos
of
lembrou
normality in gender.
sobre esse
And how
falso
did
normal. A
pandemic
pandemia,
provoke
quando
in
nos
terms of thoughts about
trancou em
this
casa,
false
ao invés de
normal?
fazer um
When
trabalho de
the
casa,
pandemic sent us back
ele nos
home,
fez
some women will ask, but what home can I go
vamos
to that
medir como vamos ir para
I can
casa
survive?
se a
And some women
normalização
will ask,
garante
how
que
can I
uma
go back
casa
home
não morre de fome.
if it is in the street that I guarantee
Falando
that
sobre
my home is not going to die of hunger? So we have the precarization
quando
of
começamos
women,
a
and
falar
this is women in
qual
a
é a
general
casa,
way.
qual é o trabalho, nós estamos
And
falando
when we talk about
das
what
mulheres
type of
negras,
home, what
pardas,
type of work, we are
periféricas.
talking about all women, but
Estamos a
in
dizer
Brazil, that means mainly
quando
the
se pergunta
black and the mixed
como
race
expressar
women.
voz, o
And
campo
then
indígena.
we have the
Nós novamente
school
estamos falando
closures, and we
dos
separate the
indígenas.
women
E aí talvez
from the
invisibilizar
grandchildren. And again, we are
as
talking about separation.
necessidades das mulheres, essa naturalização do cuidado
There are
indígena. Então, o que
several
acontece
naturalization of women as the
muito
carer.
diante
This is the
dos
attribute that
corpos
belongs to the woman,
não
to
apenas
care.
essa naturalização e normalização sobre os corpos, eles estão
So this
combinados
naturalization,
com a naturalização
normalization
de
about the
gênero,
bodies
sexo,
in
eles
terms of
estão com
gender,
naturalizações e
sex, they are
normalizações raciais.
naturalizing
Pois eles
and
entendem
normalizing
espaços
racial
de
racial
determinação. A casa para uma
definitions,
mulher
and they are using this as a space to
o trabalho para
dehumanize women.
algumas, para alguns
For some
homens, pode
women,
ser
the
um lugar
house,
doméstico durante
their
muito
home
tempo,
is
ainda que
not
ele não seja
a
um
safe
trabalho
place.
digno, ele é desumanizado pelos regimes
Some
colonialistas
women,
ocidentais. Então, eu
they
queria
work
saber,
in some informal jobs that are completely dehumanized. It's not that they are not dignified jobs, they are dehumanized by a colonial heritage. Very well, thank you, Deborah. I would like to talk to Malu as a political scientist. We have been talking about these effects of the pandemic in several areas.
Que potenciais efeitos desse momento que a gente está
In your
passando,
opinion,
a gente pode não
what
estar
are the
percebendo,
potential
mas você,
effects
como
of the
cientista
pandemic?
política e
What is
acadêmica,
going on now that
certamente
perhaps we
poderia
are not
ajudar a
noticing,
enxergar.
but you as a political scientist are already seeing as a trend or something that
perfeitamente
we are
essa
going to
pergunta,
see
eu acho que eu não vou conseguir responder
only in the
totalmente.
future? I think that this is a very good question, but I don't think that I am able to answer it
Políticos, economistas e
completely.
cientistas sociais, de uma maneira
Political
geral.
scientists, economists, and
Existem choques de
social
blocos,
scientists,
né,
we
como
talk about
esse,
exogenic shocks, like it is
como
this one,
algo que
the
vem para
pandemic,
mudar uma conjuntura e a partir
and we
daí
talk about this as something that changes a
Então,
framework
a
and it
pergunta
will
para
impact
essa
in different
pessoa
areas. So
apresentada hoje,
when you
todas
presented the
essas
panel
áreas
today, you already put the different areas, the segments
sendo
in terms of
afetadas,
the
como que
domestic
no trabalho,
uh,
na vulnerabilização da mulher
spectrum
no mercado
the pandemic is impacting on the woman in the relationships, how the pandemic is impacting on the women, how how the violence is impacting the woman in terms of violence. So Deborah brought another issue that is the problems of the difference of these exogenic shocks and because the shocks as a result of the public policies that have been applied all over the world. These are public policies that create social distancing, isolation, and as a result of these dynamics and where the gender roles have to live between the public and private space, this is an exogenic shock that has profile that can lead us to debate very important issues in terms of gender and race. I will mention a few possibilities here. First, when we think in exogenic shocks, we have to think in terms of how the current situations, the existing situations, can be deepened, and how these new situations, this new framework can create new dynamics for the vulnerabilities that already exist. For example, when we talk about women's violence or violence against women, we already hear about that in the media. And, and the pandemic impacted the access to services, and also the pandemic disrupted the support network that the women had before. The type of violence changed as well. We have now reports of new types of violence, and some of this violence is like even masks and the hand gel is being used as a violence against women. So when and in politics that also happens, and this lack of representation of women in politics goes through goes through result goes through a process that is resulting of the way that the women is recruited into politics. And actually, like we saw in the last political moment that we had in Brazil, when the women were chosen as a candidate, there were loads of barriers for them to receive funding to do their own campaign. When we talk about 2018, when we had the fake candidacies, they happened not only because of the lack of support to this candidacy, but now we can see that in the next election, something will change. The contact with the voter is not going to be the same, and the sort of support that the new candidates, mainly women that are new candidates, so these women were counting collective support, they were counting being able to be in the streets to meet the voter. This might not be possible, which means that new forms, new dynamics will crop out crop up and create more inequality in politics. I am saying all of that just to mention that when the public policies are designed thinking about gender, they do not take into account all the manners that these dynamics crisscross and impact on women and lead to other consequences. I was very interested when I heard one thing that I found very interesting about the pandemic. It was the case of Peru. We are going to go back to this issue, but I think that but one thing that you talked about representativity. In the next round of questions, we may talk about public policies. I think that at this moment, we just want to understand, uh, we want to understand more the context and understand a bit the idea of intersectionality. We are going to go back on that, Malu. This is a very interesting point, what you raised. But for now, you talked a lot intersectionality, and Marina also mentioned the fact that is very sad. We are a country that killed the highest number of transsexual women in Brazil. And of course, it's very important that we have to give attention to the lesbian, transvestite, transsexual, and all types of women, transgender women. And if you take into account all of that, Marina, and the fact that sometimes we don't have data that enable us to create more efficacious policies, how do you see the advancement in this area? For you, Marina, in particular, how it was, how it is for you to work in these two fronts. You mentioned something very interesting. You talked about data. We have a deficit of data, and we can put that in terms of the federal context where I am. When in my own secretariat, we have many other faults, but one of the problems that we have is the lack of data. We really need to think what are the indicators, what are the data, how can we produce this data in a serious way based on evidence. And it is fundamental that researchers invest on this. We have to think about this transversality, and I have to think, me, myself, as a manager, how can I achieve this transversality? In our agenda, this is very important. We think in transversality, we meet the LGBT, the trans population in different spaces, in different situations. We have to work on this transversality. This is a challenge, not not as a not just as a department, but also for me as a director of the department. It is a challenge to think about this multiplicity of spaces, and we have to think about this dialogue as a result of a social movement. How can you create bridge with the other social movements? Because until now, up to now, our motto have been from the LGBT movement. And what we achieved is as a result of this movement. And we have to create this view and rescue this memory of these movements. We have to build up bridges with the other agents, and we have to look at it from we have to look at these areas at the state level, make sure that there is transversality on those applying those policies at state level and municipalities. Because in Brazil nowadays, we have 27 realities, 27 states, 27 realities. And it is not in all states that we have a policy, an LGBT policy. It's not that we LGBT are looking for a special treatment, but we have to think that we have the same right than the others. The state has to start to think on these issues, not only at macro level, but also at micro level, when we go to the municipalities, so we can guarantee the transversality of the debate. Thank you, Marina. I would like to ask Monique something that I believe that's quite important. How can we how can we do public policies that are connected to the population if we are not making bridges with the urban fringes movements? And I would like to, I would like, if I make a mistake, tell me a bit about the project that you work, and also I would like to talk about two statements that you normally talk about. You talk about the valley of silence, and you also talk a statement that we always use, that is the syndrome of stagnated opportunity. So, Monique, I would like to you to explain these concepts that you have and how it is this reality. How can you do this integration of the movements and the public power? How can we make, how can we be heard? How can we demand? How can we do something that is really action that can achieve results? I think that that's a very interesting question. I always talk about the valley of silence. People talk about the valley of silicon, and everybody talks about the Silicon Valley, where everything's happening. But for me, innovation is about making things work independent of the area. In Brazil, a lot of things do not work. So my innovation motto is to make things to work. So I just make an analogy, and with the Silicon Valley. They have a Silicon Valley and we have a silence valley. And this has to do with the social imaginary. We talk about the urban fringes, the ghetto, the slums. We just think about Amaralina in Salvador or the slums in Rio. Favela da Rocinha, Maré. So when we talk about urban fringe, we have to think about what is possible, what realities we want to live on. And of course, here in Brazil, and now with the pandemic, we have to think that there is a silence, hence what I call the silence violence. So we have to find real solutions and learning with those that are at the base. This is our reality. We can only execute public policies with those that are at the base, people that had to adapt to that reality. When I talk about the syndrome of the stagnated opportunity and the syndrome of the complaining syndrome, uh, this is related with São Paulo state deputy. She's a black woman. And one of the things in working with this MP from São Paulo is that we are talking about the issue of money. Uh, the transvestite, the black women that are entering policy, entering politics, they never get any funding. So So when we are connecting with each other and connecting with movements that are outside this bubble, when I will give you an example, for example, the movements that are fighting for habitation, for living, appropriate living conditions. This is a constitutional right of everybody, but we have to fight for it. Of course, this is a logical issue. People talk about education, but then we definitely have to have a situation where we cannot nullify the existence of Marina, the existence of Débora. We have to build up bridges with these movements. We have to get out of this Rio São Paulo corridor that we have in Brazil. We have to go to other areas. We actually have to think that it's not just Brazil. It's not just about Brazil North and South. We have to think about Latin America and the African continent. So we have to work every day trying to burst this little bubble that we live. This way we can create a new reality. I think that this is imagination. I think that actually Marina will agree with me, uh, that when we start asking our parents, what is this? What is that? The teacher and our parents start telling us, stop asking, you are asking too much. So, and that's why we get to this adult life without having any imagination to solve these problems, because we cannot imagine this possible future. So this is how this silence, this valley of silence and this syndrome of stagnated opportunity and stagnated and complaining syndrome is what I talk about. When we talk about in Brazil and how these happen in Brazil, when we talk about the public policies in Brazil and the lack of data, uh, it is difficult. You are talking how this is difficult to create policies that are really effective. And I would like to go back to you, Malu, about I would like to talk about one point that you raised, that is the lack of visibility of gender in in politics. Brazil has a quota of women in politics that is referenced all over the world, but it doesn't bring effective results. So it doesn't seem to be so. Do you think that actually this quota of women in politics is an advancement in the causes of gender in politics? Marina, this is an excellent question. Um, when we talk about the gender quota, I believe that in Latin America it is reference. And I'm talking about that because 17 countries of Latin America has the gender quota, but this gender quota have been modified several times and redesigned so they could be effective in transforming the Latin America parliaments. We have Bolivia, Mexico, and Costa Rica that overcame Brazil in terms of the gender. We have some Latin American countries that has a these countries, they have a participation of over 50% of women in politics. So Brazil is behind them. So when this policy was applied in 98, but only it was last year that we got a significant number of women in our Chamber of Deputies. So I go back to your question, and I go back to the answers that it was mentioned by Marina, Débora, and Monique. To elect women doesn't mean necessarily transformation of public policies for for women that are more progressist. So to elect women doesn't mean approval of public policies that are considered feminist policies. But what we can see, and I will talk about this, based on observation that we can see in the National Congress in Brazil, we can see that the feminine caucus in the chamber, they normally never agree in anything, and this is their reality. And they tend to agree to two things: more women in politics, and this has to do with independent of they representing a more advanced uh, idea. It is important to have women there, so they defend that. When we look at the National Congress and we just see white men, we can see that there is a process that is a barrier for the people to be part of. So there is something that is not very democratic over there. because
Sim,
we
sim.
can see that the population in a general way is not having access to that institution. So this idea of more women in politics is supported by the feminine caucus in politics, and they are doing it together. The other, the other area that the women all agree in politics is that we have to combat the violence against women. And but then we have a problem with this one because they do not agree on what is the public policy that will eradicate the violence against women. So there is a disparity and contrasting way of how we are going to deal. But these are the two areas that the female groups agree. So I am learning a lot with you here.
Demais. Obrigada. Obrigada,
Thank
Malu.
you.
Eu queria passar a palavra para a
Malu,
Marina agora.
I would like
A gente
to
está com um pouco de tempo, então me perdoem se eu tiver que
I
fazer muita
would like
pergunta,
to
mas o que a gente quer ouvir de
ask
todos vocês
Marina
são pontos
now
interessantes para a
to
gente falar.
about something
Marina,
here, and we are running a bit late.
sobre
Marina, we talked about the
discrimination e
deficit of
anthropology
data. We talked about synergies in
a gente
public
não falou muito
policy
de
and those that are on the other side.
mas
And we
existe
haven't
uma
talked
parte
about
fundamental
resources, but this is fundamental as well.
até a Monique citou, sem recurso, de
And
fato, não tem
Monique mentioned
nesse
without
estudo,
resources, you cannot do
tem uma
anything. So,
documentação
in this
no fim de semana
regard,
pela Gênero e Número que mostrou
there is a
45 milhões
research,
de
a
população
study that it
beneficiária
was
entre
carried
sexo,
out
mulher, família e
that
direitos humanos,
out of the
esse estudo
45 millions that it was made
recebeu
available
ajuda dos
for
pais durante a
projects
comunicação
that
online,
could benefit women,
somente R$ 2.000 foram
approximately
investidos.
2,000
Eu queria
reais
entender qual é o
were
gargalo que a
invested.
gente tem para que isso,
What is
de
the
fato, se transforme em
bottleneck
solução.
to have ideas to transform in solutions in Brazil? In this context, I think that this has to do with the process, the bureaucratic process that creates barriers to execute, to, 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 to implement some of the ideas. We are working with some resources that we are working with a project that where we are thinking we have to create a project to help the trans population to be able to eat. And only now we are creating the tendering process. And the difficulty that we have with this process is the bureaucracy. There are some ways that we have to follow. It is not just about to create it's not just about to create to have the resource. We have to do it in a specific way, otherwise we are going to be accused later of deviation in the use of the resources. So in and sometimes when I am taking some decisions, I have to think myself, I, Marina Reidel, won't be answering about this later. Sometimes it's easier for me to help or to invest in a municipality or via an institution like NGO than do something myself directly from my secretariat. So when we talk about this lack of data, we have a lot of a bureaucracy and processes that we have to follow that causes us difficulty. And in this specific project that we are talking, it's just to provide food for this trans population. It will take 2 months for the food to get to these people. So every time that we have to do something that is emergential, we don't have the data. To get the data is quite easy to get the data, but the internal process between allocating the resources and getting the resources to where it should be demands a lot of measures that we have to respond to that later. It is a shame that because pandemic do not wait for anyone.
queria trazer o gancho para o empreendedorismo, que é outro ritmo,
I would like to talk
que
about
outras
the
empresas
entrepreneurship.
estão sempre
That is the other
muito
side that
mais
we want to
aceleradas.
talk about this. Innovation and entrepreneurship,
Então,
they are always
a gente
together.
fala sobre empreendedorismo às
Monique,
vezes um
when we
pouco
talk about
romantizado,
that,
até
we talk about a romantic idea of entrepreneurship.
sem romantismo. Como é que a gente
And it's interesting that
fala
you
sobre
say that entrepreneurship should be
desafios
looked at without
para as
romanticism.
mulheres,
So, Monique, tell us
principalmente
what are
quando
the
a gente
challenges
coloca
that the
uma
women
mulher, uma
face
mulher que
when we talk about
às vezes
entrepreneurship in the new urban
quer
centers.
empreender ou às vezes
A woman
perde o
wants
emprego e
to
vê
be an
que pode
entrepreneur.
encontrar uma
She
saída
loses her
nesse
job and
processo
she see the
pandemia.
idea of creating a business
Quais
as
são
the
as
way
dificuldades?
out
Até
in this
se você
pandemic. What are
pudesse,
the
a gente está muito
challenges that
conversando
this
muito sobre
woman will
isso, falou
face?
bastante interseccionalidade. Eu acho
We
que
talked a
você
lot about
pode tentar
intersectionality before. Perhaps
explicar
you should
o que
touch
seria
upon
a
that.
interseccionalidade também, por
What
favor.
is this intersectionality? If you could talk about that.
Então, vamos por partes.
Well,
É muito. Você falou no início, Marina, sobre 7 milhões de mulheres
Marina, you
empregadas
talked about the
desde o
7
início
million women that
da
lost their
pandemia.
jobs since the beginning of
E assim,
pandemic.
não é nada romântico, não me
And
descredibilize
it's not
isso,
romantic that.
né?
It's
Eu
not.
sim empreendo, tenho minhas empresas, ok,
I
mas
have my companies, I am an entrepreneur,
nesse
but I
sentido,
am not a romantic
mas
about.
assim possibilidades.
I don't think that we have to
Então,
start from zero
falando
without the
sobre o
tools.
lado
I think that this is a very
importante a gente
perverse
falar de
discourse.
meritocracia
And I'm not going to talk
justamente
about
por causa disso.
meritocracy, because when
Existe
we
uma
talk about
grande
meritocracy,
possibilidade de ser um
uh,
futuro
it's
sonegador de impostos
is
que
just
acredita
is
que
just
eu
for
sou
certain
pobre,
groups and
contribuidor,
some
não vou pagar
tax
imposto, não vou
evaders.
pagar para o
These
Estado.
are the people that believe that
Então, quem quiser
they
fazer
achieved
isso,
what they
super
achieved just
interessante por esse
based on
lado.
their effort, but normally it's because they
Mas
had some
sobre esses desafios das
subsidy
mulheres
on taxes. So
empreendedoras,
when we talk about the
principalmente,
challenges
onde
to
está indo o dinheiro desses
women that
recursos que
are
estão
business women,
surgindo agora
we
de
have
forma
to
muito
ask
rápida?
ourselves, where are
Onde está
going
sendo
the money?
feito?
Where
Onde vai
to
chegar o
the
semente?
money
Quem
for
são
the
essas
pandemic is
empresas?
going?
Eu sempre
Who are the
falo
companies that are
sobre
receiving this money?
esses
I
unicórnios, que
always
falam
had
tanto de
a
unicórnio, mas que unicórnio não existe. E as
fight.
empresas
The
que
idea when I
são
was a child, people told me, "Oh,
maiores
unicorns do not
no século
exist."
XXI.
But now I learned that in
Então,
business,
assim, é uma
unicorns
crise,
do exist.
não só crise de saúde pública, mas
So when
financeira,
we talk
política,
about
50% das pessoas são pobres.
health
Então,
crisis,
assim, que
we are
lógica que a
talking
gente vai
about
trabalhar
companies
numa
that are
previdência que não garante
dismissing
o
50%
principal
of their
elemento, que é o
employees. So
acesso
what sort of
ao
entrepreneurship is
financiamento,
that
seja
no one can be
brasileiro,
there?
chega
Why
aqui,
is
seja
not
no mundo.
heavy?
E o segundo
Why
ponto
is
é que a
not
sociedade
the
precisa
whole
começar
population?
a pensar
Why
em negócios inclusivos.
why
Outro ponto
don't
não vai
we
ser,
all have
eu vou trazer
access
primeiro
to financing?
a greve dos entregadores de aplicativos. Os
In
chefes não podem ceder,
on the
os
last
chefes não podem
first
ceder ao
of the
poder.
month,
Então, a gente precisa discutir a alternativa. E o
we
teste
saw
social que foi desenhado,
the
socialmente,
delivery people
não
that
tem essa possibilidade,
from
porque não
apps
reflete
doing a
sobre
strike.
as pessoas
So
são
perhaps we should
co-criadoras,
create some
por mais
co-op
que seja difícil
platforms where
trazer para o
people
código. No
have
Brasil, a
some
gente precisa
ownership.
lembrar das leis
In
do Brasil.
Brazil, we talk about
Então,
that. We have
muitas
to
empresas,
understand the laws.
pessoas pretas,
There are some laws that
terem
prevent some black
propriedade,
people
um pedaço de
of
terra.
having
Mesmo com a
property.
abolição da escravatura,
In
essa
Brazil,
lei existe.
there are
Então, a
still
gente não podia
laws
desconhecer
saying
os
that
imigrantes que estavam
black
aqui
people couldn't
trabalhando
have
sem título de Estado.
uh,
Então, as pessoas precisam
land.
ter
That was in the
certeza de
past.
que
So the
aquele lugar
immigrants
tem
coming, they
propriedade.
could buy a
Isso é
property,
muito
but we black
importante.
people
Então,
couldn't
existem
have.
novos
So
modelos
we
de
have to
negócio
understand this idea
nesse
of
sentido.
ownership. When we talk
Mas
about
também
new
acredito que o desafio é bem
business
estrutural.
models,
Não
we
posso
have
falar
to
que
talk
vai
about
aumentar esse
the
negócio
situation
daqui
of
5 ou
women.
25
I think
anos.
that there is the
Vão ser daqui
structural
15.
moment.
Então, assim, não é
I
porque
have a
hoje
company
as
since I
coisas
was 15 years
mudam que
old,
significa
and
que
it
não vai
wasn't
ser.
because I had some
Inclusive
social
negras,
assistance.
inclusive
I am
racistas, primeiro
still a
imagina,
black woman.
nas negociações.
Race
Primeiro
came in my
imagina que
in my
eu vou fazer
negotiations
valor
before
sobre aquilo
gender.
que eu tenho para oferecer.
First,
Então,
they
esse
would
universo
look at
de
me. I am
mulheres nesse
black,
lugar
then I am a woman, and then they look at what I have to
de
offer.
unicórnio
So we
não,
have to
não
bet
existe.
on
A
new
gente não
business
morreu, a gente teve
models, but this
esse
doesn't
tsunami
exist
e a gente não morreu por
uh,
causa de uma zebra.
when we talk about women. So we have to bet in a new
E
reality.
interseccional, como perguntaram.
And this is
Ou seja,
intersectional, as
interseccionalidade.
you've
Quer
mentioned.
dizer, de forma mais simples possível, da forma que eu
in
expliquei
a
na minha
simple
mulher
way,
de 12 anos, é que você é mulher, mas
you
outros
are a
tipos, você pode
woman,
ser mulher e
but
branca,
you are a
ou
woman
preta
and
e
black. You can be
travesti,
a
woman
woman
preta e
black and
travesti e
transvestite,
lésbica, e também
woman
vai somar tudo isso. É
black,
uma coisa que a gente tem
transvestite,
que finalizar
and
que não existe
homosexual and
situação
lesbian.
de opressão.
So
Então,
we
assim,
have to
tudo
understand that there is
isso
this oppression
vai me chamar para a
hierarchy.
rua hoje e
It
falar
doesn't
sobre
mean that because I am
essa
black
etnia
woman,
que
black,
levanta a bandeira do machismo. Não existe isso.
and
Então, essas
so you
opressões
cannot
que
have
você
this
citou,
situation where
essas
I today
opressões
I
que você
raise the
citou,
banner of
são
racism, but
tudo
tomorrow I
situações
am
que a gente
like
sofre mais.
raising the banner of makeism.
Perfeito. Uma das melhores explicações que eu já ouvi sobre isso.
That's a very good explanation, Maria.
Bom,
Thank you.
a gente vai
This is one of the best
encaminhar para a
explanations that I've
nossa
heard in this area.
conversa,
Now
infelizmente.
we are going the
Mas eu
final
queria trazer uma
round of
reflexão.
questions,
O Brasil
and
tem
I
uma
would like to
bandeira
bring to you
da
a
pluralidade
reflection.
curricular desde
Here
a
in Brazil Forum, we have
desenvolvimento de uma estratégia de
diversity
parceria
as a
jornada
pillar
segunda,
of
como resultado 52%
of
são
our
formadas por
objectives since the
mulheres,
beginning.
buscamos garantir uma
This year, we
paridade
decided
de
that
gênero diversa,
52% of our panelists should be
mulheres que
women,
falam
and this
não apenas de gênero, mas
guaranteed
também
a
de política, desenvolvimento,
innovative
cultura e
parity in
sociedade.
gender in our panels. And women are
Temos
talking not just
metas
about gender, but they
concretas
talk
já
about
atingidas,
economy,
que eu
politics,
quero reforçar
development,
para todos,
health,
mas ainda
etc., and
muito
etc.
alto. Ao longo
So
desse
we
ano, a
also
gente
aim
aprendeu
for
que a
a
inclusão
racial
comunitária
and
é uma
geographical
estratégia que
diversity.
tem que ser contínua, e a gente
And
vem
doing this
conseguindo
work, we learned
avanços
that
com o
this
processo
diversity
de
is
um Brasil
something
cada vez mais diverso.
that
Vocês
demands a
são mulheres
strategic
que nos fazem acreditar
commitment.
que essa transformação
You are
é possível,
women
ainda
that
que
make
seja
us
um
believe
desafio
that this
natural.
transformation is
Você,
possible,
Monique,
even though it's
é um
difficult.
dos grandes
Monique, you bring to
protagonistas no
us,
centro do debate
you
e da
bring
luta
the
de forma tão
urban
clara.
fringe to the
Você, Marina,
urban
representa
center
pautas tão
in
importantes para
terms
nós
of debate and
no
action.
Brasil.
You,
Uma luta
Marina,
que nos representa
represent very
internacionalmente
important
também,
agenda in this
diante de
context that is
relações,
very
conforme
challenging.
de
Malu, you
paridade.
represent Brazil
E você,
internationally
Débora, que
in terms of gender, showing a
representa
great quality in
coragem
terms of the
e são,
debate.
de fato,
And you,
companheiras
Deborah, via
irresistíveis
your
para
resilience
apresentadores
and
que falam
bravery,
sistematicamente a
which is
verdade.
so poignant, you
A
do not
coragem
give
de
up
vocês mostra como
and
a diversidade
acknowledge,
pode ser
and you
transversal.
defend women based on
Por
your
isso, eu
technical
queria encerrar a
knowledge.
nossa conversa
So I would like to finish
pedindo
our
para cada uma de
conversation
vocês
by asking each
nos
one of
ajudar
you
também a transcender essa inspiração para quem está nos
to
assistindo,
help us
para que cada
to
um possa também
transcend
refletir de que forma a gente consegue atravessar
this
essa
all of
transformação nos
this.
nossos
I
territórios.
would like you to tell us
Eu queria
something that
começar
can
com
help
você,
us
Débora,
to
por favor,
expand our role in our own segments.
compartilhar com a
Deborah,
gente
perhaps you can
o que
start.
você acha que a gente pode fazer para fortalecer a
Deborah,
visão
what
das
do you think?
transformações
How can we, what we can do
sociais
to
no
enhance
setor
our
privado,
bridges with
no
the social
governo e, no
movements,
caso, a
private
academia,
sector,
para
government,
que
and
essas
also the
mudanças sejam de
academia?
fato interseccionais e
Uh,
transversais.
and we can get, so we can get transversality.
Transformação social ela é solitária, Marina. Nós só
Well,
existimos
no social transformation
o primeiro
is
fantasma que nós
isolated.
devemos se afastar
The
é
first
de que
ghost
essas
that we have
realidades são
to
solitárias. Elas são coletivas e
demystify
igualitárias e
is
multifacetárias.
understand that
Nesse
this
momento que
transformation have
vivemos
to be
a
collective.
pandemia,
In the
nesse
moment that we are
isolamento,
living the
nesse
pandemic,
distanciamento que devemos
that there
cumprir,
are
sabemos
rules,
que será necessário nos
isolation,
afastarmos mais.
social
O
isolation
espaço é um
rules
espaço
that prevent us from being
de
together.
encontro
We have
político,
to understand
é um espaço
what
de
is going to be our
conversa.
political
Então, enquanto eu falo
space
aqui,
to make
está todo mundo
politics, and this is the
junto, para
virtual
se
space.
aproximar,
So
que esse seja um momento de
I think
transformação, mas um
that
momento de
this
encontrar.
is an
É isso, os
opportunity
encontros, e nós não
to get
precisamos
closer to each
concordar em
other.
tudo.
We
Nós
don't need to
precisamos de um
agree
ponto.
in
E
everything,
viver
but
o agonístico da política,
we have to
viver o
understand
agressivo,
the agonistic
tem hora que a gente vai se encontrar, tem hora que a
factors in
gente vai se
politics
apoiar.
as something
Hum,
that can
e
put
é
us
assim,
together. Sometimes we are going to agree
e é
on
assim que
things,
nós
but other
ajudamos
times we are
pessoas
not
a
going to
essas
agree.
conversas.
And I think that is important to have
Muito
this
obrigada,
diversity
Débora.
of
Muito obrigada.
voices. Deborah,
Objetivo
thank you.
atingido. Pelo menos aqui, muito inspirador.
So I think that this
Malu,
was
para
very good,
você,
Deborah. Malu,
como
for you.
representante da academia, né, como que a
as a representative of the academia. How can we build up these bridges with the social movements, with the private sector, with the government? So all these different segments and areas, even though we are living this difficult moment, how can we work together to advance in this agenda? How can we be closer together to share our knowledge? How can we use this for the advancement of gender? Sound.
Obrigada. Essa é uma pergunta que eu tenho pensado bastante a respeito.
This is something that I've been thinking about, actually.
Acadêmicas
We have
mudando a forma
some academics that are changing the way that we communicate academic results, that are changing the way that we communicate research results. Sometimes we have a difficulty in the academia of fitting the academia result with what is the reality of the public. So some of the researchers, they are doing an excellent work in exposing and communicating these ideas in a language that's more accessible to others. This is very important. Another issue here is the fact that we have researchers that are outside the country that can get funds, that can bring people to do collaborations with Brazil, for Brazil, working for Brazil, but outside Brazil, because we understand the difficulty that Brazil is going on at the moment when we talk about academic research. So it is important to create these bridges. And I think that transformation also happens in the classroom. We as teachers, we have to think about who we are at the classroom and what we are conveying to our students. We have to understand ourselves as multipliers, what our students can do with what we teach them. So I think if we work in these three fronts, academia is important for social transformation. Thank you, Malu. Now I would like to hear Marina Reidel. Marina, please tell us, what do you think? How can we build up these bridges? I believe that first, we cannot be quiet. We cannot be in silence. The silence is not a good tool for this moment. Also, we have to seek other networks beyond our own networks. When we talk about human rights, we have to, people are very focused on, I am LGBT, so I'm going to talk just about the LGBT rights. But I think that we have to think beyond who we are. We have to talk about all the issues, and we have to bring the sensibilization, the awareness of humanization to all of us. Our society will need that for a long time still. As teachers and opinion formers, we have a fundamental role in that. I was a teacher for 26 years, and as a teacher, I lived my own transition when I was in the school environment. I think that as teachers, we have to create a basis that the student can understand, respect. And in my case, my students learn that by looking at my own experience. We have to create networks beyond our own networks. That's how I think that we can create those bridges. And I would like to ask you, Monique, please.
É isso, eu concordo com todas.
I agree with all of you. I was never shy. I was silenced before. The machismo is so perverse that we just end up being, we quieten ourselves. We know that there are oppressing actions that play, that have a play in our lives, and we have to to find the cycle
Seria um círculo seguro
of
dentro de você
affection.
construir, né,
It's not about I love
esse
you, it is
coletivo.
about
Foi isso
being
que
able to talk
a
to other
Débora
people,
pontuou, então, assim,
as it was mentioned by
na
Deborah.
minha cabeça
So
veio
it is related to that.
aula de matemática, né, vários círculozinhos
You have to think like, like
são mais
mathematics, and there
difíceis,
was several
né, de
circles
realizar,
that we have to
porque
put
são
together.
muitas pessoas,
We
praticamente ninguém
have
consegue fazer tudo sozinho,
this idea that
mas
we
esse
can do everything on our
coletivo,
own, this
essa coisa comunitária,
self-sufficient
assim, algo
myth,
até em Canva
this
que
should be
não
destroyed.
conseguimos imaginar e tudo mais.
I think that is the moon. The moon is
Mas eu digo isso,
inspiring me
assim,
to
real, de
be,
verdade,
so
você, Marina, que citou meu livro,
using
né,
such
de
an
uma forma
emotional
muito
language.
simples, eu sou super,
Marina
super mega acadêmica, assim,
explained that in a
eu
very
tô dando aula
basic.
porque é isso que eu quero.
Marina,
Faço
Marina said, you have to use a basic language, a clear
mas
language.
como
And
eu pego
for me, I am an
eu
academic,
nunca
and next year I'm going to be teaching.
não sou
So I
uma
have to understand how can I
pesquisadora,
talk
né?
about this?
Sou
We should not be
complementar,
talking about academia is this, society is that. We have
sempre em
to
torno desse
understand that they complement each other.
público, sociedade, privado,
We cannot separate public
uma
and
coisa
society.
interligada.
We are in the middle. We are a bit of
Somos
everything,
todos
and we
parte.
have to share that.
Não adianta
We
ser umbigo
we are the
perfeito.
whole only when we
Porque
share
senão
every
foi
bit of
isso na
that, every
pandemia,
bit of
assim,
the
as
society.
pessoas que
And we can
entraram
see that in the pandemic. And
pela
I
porta
hope that
também têm que
after the
cuidar disso. A
pandemic,
Malu,
this
nossa
will
colega,
be
sobre uma
this will be
coletividade e
clearer.
essa
This is
coletividade
not
que
about
vai
Monique, this is not about Deborah, this is not about Malu, this is not about Marina.
reconhecer a
We
subjetividade,
have to
mas o
recognize
resultado, o
the
impacto é
subjectivities
coletivo. É
and
isso. Obrigada.
the effort is individual, but the impact is collective.
Bom, nosso painel está chegando ao fim.
Well, our panel is getting to an end, but before I would like to remind you, the ones who are watching us, that in recognition to the extraordinary times, at the end of each panel, Brazil Forum UK will present a finance campaign related to the theme. Considering the data of domestic violence, which became even more alarming during the period of uh, isolation, today we want to highlight the project Mapa do Recolhimento, who works to offer psychological and legal support to victims of domestic violence across Brazil. This is collective donations for women that are suffering violence of gender and solicitors who want to help them. The amount is going to make it possible to maintain the group that continues this service and has been supporting more the 800 municipalities. If you want, just go to the Brazil Forum UK in social media, Instagram, Facebook, to know some more. Now it's time to say goodbye. I would like to thank all our guests for all the contributions. Thank you so much, Monique, Marina, Débora, Malu. I'm very happy to have you here today. Thank you to construct with us a dialogue so important and necessary to reflect the paths for us to have a Brazil without all this inequality and to respect the individuality of each one, because without that we can't go forward. And also like to thank the volunteers who make up our organizing committee, especially Luisa Santa Barbara, Marianza Filozola, Camila Paisini, who actively participated in the collaboration of this gender. Studio 42 for production, across which interprets the event in English. Mais Diferenças, Marlon, Susana, for the interpretation in sign language, to TV Estadão, and especially to you who has been following us. You can see in our site whenever you want, www. Brazil Forum and our social network. So I'll see you again, 6th of July, 5 p.m. Brazil time and 9 p.m. in UK with the panel China and the International Relations of Brazil, with the participation of Paulo Nogueira Batista and teachers Monica Hurst, Adriana Denur, and Rosana Pinheiro Machado. We are waiting for you on